and we move forward. Buongiorno a tutti, il tema del quale abbiamo piacere di discutere oggi è, diciamo così, costantemente sui giornali, costantemente in televisione in questi giorni. Brexit, sogno o incubo? È una questione credo particolarmente complessa all'interno soprattutto di un ambiente di persone che condividono anche gli stessi valori di fondo, nel senso una fiducia nei confronti della libertà individuale e una analoga fiducia nei confronti delle istituzioni pubbliche che non esondino dai loro limiti, perché persone con le stesse condizioni di fondo hanno preso posizioni molto diverse sul tema. Parte la Brexit è evidentemente l'esito di una corrente di pensiero, di un approccio molto forte, molto presente nel partito conservatore britannico. In parte la Brexit è anche l'esito di una convinzione degli inglesi che ci sia un eccezionalismo inglese, ci sia una differenza di fondo tra le loro istituzioni e quelle del resto del continente. Per noi che restiamo, comunque perlomeno per ora, sicuramente l'uscita del Regno Unito dall'Unione Europea è la perdita di una componente importante del dibattito, delle visioni anche spesso in conflitto, però in fecondo conflitto sul futuro dell'Unione Europea. A me fa molto piacere che noi riusciamo a fare questa discussione oggi con Dalibor Rohac, che è un caro amico da tanti anni, è un Oxford man, ma ha lavorato in diversi think tank, ha lavorato prima al Legatum Institute in Inghilterra, poi al Istituto Centre for Global Prosperity, Istituto Institute of Washington DC, e da qualche anno è un fellow dell'American Enterprise Institute, probabilmente il più prestigioso think tank conservatore, e soprattutto fra i think tank americani quello che più è ancora fedele all'idea di un think tank come università senza studenti, cioè come realtà il cui compito si realizza sostanzialmente ponendo assieme un gruppo di studiosi molto importanti e molto originali, lasciandoli lavorare sui loro temi. Dalibor ha anche scritto di recente un libro su questioni europee, Towards an Imperfect Union, a Conservative Case for the EU, dove l'enfasi sull'imperfezione come qualcosa di non necessariamente negativo segnala sin dal titolo una differenza di sfumature molto rilevante sia nei confronti del conservative case contro l'Unione Europea, sia nei confronti invece di quella che, se volete, l'approccio più tradizionale di studiosi, pensatori, uomini politici che si proclamano europeisti, invece quello che vogliono è un continuo accentramento di funzioni in capo alle istituzioni europee. Quindi penso che sia veramente in una posizione unica per fornirci una prospettiva originale e feconda sulla Brexit. Ringraziamo molto e cedo subito la parola.
Thank you, Alberto. Good morning, everybody. It's an enormous pleasure to be at the Istituto Bruno Leoni. I've been a fan for a very long time, and this is my first time visiting in person, both the Institute and Milan, and so far it's been just absolutely delightful. So thank you, Alberto, for inviting me, for hosting this event, and for your kind introduction. I would like to talk about Brexit and the sort of technical side of things, and there was a vote taking place today, and we can sort of talk about the politics and sort of technical side of those things. But I would like to start maybe on a more general, broader note, and just to tell you a little bit about how my own thinking evolved on the subject of European integration. So the first thing to know about me is that although I work at the American Enterprise Institute, I'm not myself American. I was born and brought up in Slovakia. I was born in the 1980s when it was still a communist regime, and was 6 years old when the whole thing collapsed, and it was one of the sort of most crucial sort of intellectual influences in my life. It really sort of set me on this path towards studying economics and social science and trying to understand why some countries were more successful than others. And so as a kid, I stumbled upon writings of classical liberals and traditional sort of English-speaking conservatives, which were being translated into Czech and Slovak at the time. And so by the age of 17, I was sort of an evangelizing libertarian Eurosceptic. It was at a time when Slovakia was trying to join the EU, and I was among the few people who were vehemently opposed to it. And I sort of knew all these sort of talking points from our English conservative friends by heart. I at some point interned for the office of the president of the Czech Republic, Václav Klaus at the time, who is very well known for his
still an evangelizing libertarian Eurosceptic.
So he's, I think he moved to an even more extreme positions, perhaps abandoning big parts of his libertarianism. And I was still working at Cato. I've been working at AEI, where the central gravity in Washington among conservatives is somewhat Eurosceptic. I inherited my current writing desk at AEI from John Bolton, who is now the national security advisor to President Trump. But a few years ago, I have to say that I've come to change my mind a little bit on the subject of Europe and of the European project. And so I outlined that argument in my book that came out. And I would like to, I don't want to bore you with going over the argument, but the sort of simple proposition I'd like to put to you is that by and large, the European project is a friend of classical liberals, not their enemy. And the first observation that might help us establish that is to just look at the experience of post-communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe. So I'm from Slovakia. Slovakia is now a member of the EU, alongside several other countries of the region. But since 1990, real incomes in that part of the world went up quite dramatically, by 50% in the Czech Republic. They more than doubled in Slovakia, tripled in Poland. Life expectancy in my country went up by 7 years, from something like 70 years to 77. And there are, like any metric you look at, and I know that there are debates about the Visegrad countries and Hungary and Poland and the sort of creeping authoritarianism, but by and large, the sort of big picture is that this has been an extraordinary achievement, an extraordinary success. And when you look at Poland and you look at its neighbor to the east, Ukraine, well, the two countries started from the same per capita income in 1990. Any kind of metric you look at was pretty much the same in 1990. And Ukraine, in comparison to Poland, is a disaster. I mean, so real incomes have barely grown, but barely. And all of these other metrics of well-being and health and whatever you want to look at have just diverged dramatically. And so the most distinguishing mark really about Poland relative to Ukraine is the fact that Poland had, since the fall of communism, a prospect of joining the community of Western European nations, the EU and NATO. And Ukraine never had that. And that made a big difference, I would argue, for the outcome of those transitions. So whenever we criticize the EU, and there's a lot to criticize the EU for, I think it's something that we have to keep in mind. Obviously, the reason why the EU played such a role in that part of the world is that it served as a sort of commitment device, as a sweetener for reformers who wanted to do the right thing in the 1990s. In Ukraine, when you wanted to reform the country, it was very hard to sort of stick with this road and sort of persevere in those reform efforts. Whereas in Poland, you could always tell voters that there'll be this big reward at the end. When we join the EU and we'll have access to free movement and EU funds. That might be considered a good or bad thing, depending on where you stand. But I mean, that played a role in sort of making the case for very often costly and difficult reforms. And so Ukraine never had access to that sort of sweetener, to that sort of commitment device. Now, this idea of the EU as a commitment mechanism, I think, goes beyond just the narrow question of what happens in transitions. I've had many discussions with my sort of free trading-minded libertarian friends who say, we don't need the EU to have economic openness on the continent. Like, all we have to do is to just, scrap tariffs and quotas and other forms of protectionism. Let's have, unilateral free trade, and we don't need a bureaucracy in Brussels to do that. And there is certain logic to that. But there are problems with that argument, and the most important problem is a public choice problem. That obviously, when you say that we should have unilateral free trade, you're essentially saying, let's keep it in the hands of politicians, and let's hope that they behave wisely going forward. And it is the case that political discretion simply does not always lead to good outcomes. And especially on trade issues, there is always a temptation to give special privileges to politically connected interest groups. So this sort of idea that unilateral free trade across Europe would be somehow a stable outcome if it were just left in the hands of elected politicians is, to me, a somewhat implausible proposition. So if politicians, go ahead and tie their hands through an arrangement like the EU, like when they tie their hands through various trade agreements, to me, that's largely a beneficial thing. And the other important thing to realize about trade in the European context is that tariffs and quotas and these sort of traditional forms of protectionism that you can just get rid of are only one part of the problem. As in the post-war years, the world got progressively rid of tariffs and quotas. What states have started to do instead was to regulate in ways that keep foreign competition out. Sometimes deliberately, sometimes by accident. Regulatory barriers have grown between sort of advanced industrial countries. And the EU, since the 1980s, has sort of reversed the trend on the continent. I mean, the EU single market does much more than just provide for an absence of quotas and tariffs. It provides a guarantee, much like the Commerce Clause of the US Constitution, that if you have a good or service that's produced or sort of sold in one member state, it can be in principle sold or marketed elsewhere in the EU. And having that mechanism in place actually does require some level of policy coordination and thinking. Like, yes, it would be nice to have unrestricted mutual recognition when we say, well, German standards are as good as ours, and Polish standards are as good as ours, and we'll just allow goods and services to flow freely. But in reality, the politics of it is much more complicated. So then you end up, whether you like it or not, and that happens with trade agreements as well, with some layer of common norms, standards, with something that looks somewhat like what we have in the EU. And it's not an accident, by the way, that the single European market but is largely a product of British leadership in the European project. And the Single European Act was written by Arthur Buckfield, who was a conservative British conservative politician, European Commissioner, very much under the guidance of Margaret Thatcher. And this brings me to this question of democratic deficit. And I think there's something that deserves a sort of careful examination. But I think there's a sense when we are talking about these trade issues and economic issues where democratic deficit can be considered a good thing, right? Like we oftentimes delegate decisions to central banks and various independent bodies, or we just enshrine them in constitutions to tie the hands of politicians in sort of socially beneficial ways, so to speak. So having the European Commission pressure the Italian government into privatizing the steel industry in the 1990s and pressuring the French into opening up the electricity market, I guess there is a sort of degree of democratic deficit about that, having bureaucrats boss you around. But I mean, if it leads to sort of more open, better economic outcomes, I'm willing to give it a try. If it's sort of happening within a sort of broader system of democratic accountability. And I think the danger we have right now is not the rise of some sort of quasi-authoritarian European superstate, but rather that the EU institutions will be too weak in the face of rising nationalist temptations of all kinds, all sorts in the EU. So it's not just the nationalist populists, but also if you follow German politics, there is a discussion within the CDU about the role of industrial policy, about sort of trying to promote national champions and giving it sort of government subsidized loans, etc., etc. So that goes very much against the spirit and the written word really of the European single market. But if you have Germany doing this, I know the French always wanted to do that, but it's going to be very hard to sort of sustain that arrangement that we have in Europe. And obviously there's a lot to criticize about the European Competition Authority and the way it gets heavy-handed with especially new industries, and talk about the copyright directive and about like the way they've been like going after specific US tech companies and like I'm very critical of that part of the European architecture, but we shouldn't be fooling ourselves and thinking that if this somehow went away, the counterfactual would be a freer, more open, more competitive Europe. No, it would be Europe with like 28 different regulatory standards designed to keep foreign competition out. I mean, that's what like national governments always wanted to do, and sort of lucky accident that the EU has sort of tamed those instincts a little bit. I want to end up. I know we want to talk about Brexit, but I want to end up on a somewhat historical note or sort of history of thought note. Because very often in popular imagination, the European project is associated with like the sort of progressivism of people like Altiero Spinelli, or the sort of technocratic functionalism of Jean Monnet, where it becomes sort of like technical exercise where we are like moving towards a superstate, and I think it's somewhat reductionist to sort of say that these were the founding fathers of Europe and these were the ideas which were very often quite misguided in their essence, because there is an alternative tradition of sort of European federalism which is very tightly connected to the classical liberal tradition. So actually there's several ones. So one is the sort of conservative Catholic personalism of the 1920s and 1930s. Figures like Denis de Rougemont in France and others who understood that the nation state can be oppressive and sort of Jacobinic in its nature, and it's best when it's decentralized and sort of embedded in a broader system of rules. And the other tradition that like I'm more familiar with and identify myself with more closely is the one of the 1938 Walter Lippmann colloquium in Paris. A group of free market intellectuals met in Paris in August 1938 to talk about problems facing the continent. They talked about domestic policy, but they more importantly talked about the rising nationalism, militarism, totalitarian regimes. There was Stalin's Russia, there was Hitler's Germany about to start the war, there was Franco, there was Mussolini. So all of these people who after the war founded the Mont Pelerin Society, or not all of them, but some of them anyway, were at this colloquium talking about what could be done to make sure that like these sort of destructive tendencies of nationalism be restrained in the future. And so a year later, Hayek publishes this essay where he says that the abrogation of national sovereignties and the creation of an effective international order of law is a necessary complement and the logical consummation of the classical liberal program. He very explicitly goes back and is very critical of the 19th century classical liberal tradition that sort of ignores the role that international environment is playing in sort of shaping decisions of government. And many people of his generation, classical liberals of his generation, didn't see that statement as controversial. So Wilhelm Röpke was a German economist who was credited with the post-war miracle in Germany. So he wrote 2 books during the war on international federalism, on how essentially the Swiss model could serve as a blueprint for the post-war reconstruction of Europe. in which there would be some sort of central authority to restrain the nation states, and there would be sort of decentralization, etc., etc. Even figures, I didn't realize it until relatively recently. Ludwig von Mises, who was really like by far the most radical of this group, he once like slammed the door at the Mont Pelerin Society meeting, saying, "You're all a bunch of socialists." So when he arrived in America in 1944, he publishes this essay, Omnipotent Government, with Yale University Press, and there he says that if Western democracies do not succeed in establishing a permanent union, by which he means a sort of federal superstate, the fruits of victory will be lost again. And obviously, closer to home, we can talk about Luigi Einaudi, and Bruno Leoni himself, I believe, was at least in the 50s, talking quite openly about how it will be from the young people that the President of the United States of Europe will be raised.
And students were pretty much so. I mean, some of the also European federalists in the bad sense were students of their own.
Okay. So it has to be said that the Europe that we have today is very different from the idea of a European federation that people like Hayek and Mises and others had in mind. But the right answer to that, the right reaction to that from classical liberals is not to say, well, we have to dismantle the EU or just leave, but to really sort of join the political fight and push for a federalist, I mean, in the true sense of the word, agenda, federalist in the sort of Tocquevillian, Hayekian, Ostromian, if you will, sense, if you will. That means fragmenting political power at different levels, depending on the sort of public goods we want these different layers of government to provide. I think that would mean in the European context making some parts of Europe's architecture stronger while devolving others to nation states and beyond them. I would like to see more people working on that and sort of pushing that agenda. I mean, there is some debate, obviously, after all these crises that the EU has been through, within the EPP, perhaps within other political groups. But I think sort of classical liberals should be more out there participating in those conversations. Okay, talking about the European reform, if you will, in addition to Brexit, but I would just want to leave you at the end of these opening remarks with just two thoughts, which is that by standards, by historical standards, by the view of long view of history, Europe today is an anomaly in a positive sense, sort of age of peace and economic openness and prosperity. And I know that there has been a dramatic economic slowdown across the West over the past decades, but it's sort of what we enjoy is quite unique, and it's very often taken for granted, even in a place like Slovakia, where there is now a generation of people who don't remember what life was like under communism, who don't remember that there was a barbed wire that separated us from Austria. And obviously the sort of historic memory of sort of the heyday of nation states, the end of the 19th century, I mean, that also gets distorted. We sometimes associated with this first age of globalization, but the run-up to the First World War was really about the return of protectionism to some extent. You had the Melin tariff in France, you had the steel and the German tariff adopted earlier, iron and rye tariff, of course. So I think taking this sort of longer-term historical perspective is useful in sort of assessing, the extent to which we are sort of displeased with what we see in Brussels, and obviously there is a lot to be displeased about. And the second point is that, Europe today, like much of the West, is coming under, a fair amount of stress that we haven't seen for a while. So there are, these political realignments we are seeing across European countries, in the United States, which I don't think we quite understand. Is it just one-off blip that somebody like Trump got elected president, or does it signal a deeper change in sort of political coalitions built around different parties? You have rising powers to the east. Many people in Central Eastern Europe are understandably nervous about Russia. It has to be said that like China's economic rise is a wonderful thing, brought millions and millions of people out of poverty, but there is a sort of geopolitical agenda that the regime is pursuing. We shouldn't be blind to, and you have erosion of democratic standards in some parts of the world, including in Eastern Europe, places like Poland and Hungary. We have Turkey and the Philippines, and to some people, authoritarianism seems to be a viable, perhaps even desirable alternative to liberal democracy, and so I think it's a potentially dangerous situation. I don't say that we are back into the 1930s, but we are in a place which leaves very little space for complacency, and I think in that situation it's important that particularly people who have been so right about so many things in the past, namely classical liberals and traditional conservatives, that they pick their sides carefully. And I'll end on this note for now, but obviously we can talk about it.
And should we say something on Brexit before leaving it up?
Sure. So I published this book before the British referendum, and I went to the UK and debated Eurosceptic MPs, and it was great fun. Then they voted. Obviously, the British people voted to leave by, it's not an insignificant margin, but it wasn't, wasn't like an overwhelming majority in favor of leaving. But I mean, I accepted the outcome of the referendum. It did not offend me. I think it's perfectly reasonable for a country to decide to reconsider its place within the European project. I mean, the British have always had this sort of ambivalent relation with the continent. It's something that, I think goes back centuries. Brendan Sims wrote a wonderful book. He's a historian at Cambridge about sort of ongoing debate in British foreign policy, whether they should be involved on the continent or whether they should sort of look at the outside world, and sort of periodically reappears. And so perhaps this was like another iteration of the same argument. Obviously, the debate took place already in the 1970s, with many people on the conservative side campaigning the pro-EU forces, Margaret Thatcher famously campaigning for membership in the EEC, and people like Jeremy Corbyn vehemently opposing it because they saw the EEC as some sort of neoliberal plot to destroy British planning and the welfare state. And I think Jeremy Corbyn is still sort of stuck in that mentality, which has a lot of explanatory power, both for the outcome of the referendum and also for the dysfunctional politics that followed. So it shouldn't be a surprise. The British are perfectly sort of entitled to seek a different arrangement. We can talk about what those possibilities are. But the problem I sensed was twofold. One, that the trade-offs involved in leaving were not always truthfully articulated by people who I think should have known better, or people I like and admire and read on a daily basis. I think we're making a sort of bet that is unlikely to work out in the end. So when you sort of join a coalition in pursuit of something like Brexit with people who do not have a free market agenda, in the hope that in the end the free market agenda will prevail, I mean, it's a risky endeavor. And that's exactly what people like Dan Hannan and Michael Gove and Boris Johnson and many others have done. Joining forces with people who wanted to get the UK out of the EU just to restrict immigration, or perhaps the hard left to go back to like big state economic planning, and it's true that like the free market forces do not have the upper hand in the post 2016 negotiations. So the first big red line drawn by the UK government was that we are not going to continue with free movement of people. So that ruled out what I thought was the most reasonable way forward, namely a UK membership in the European Economic Area along the lines of Norway or Iceland. There were many sensible people on the Leave side who were arguing that if we were to leave, it would be following that same model, and then going forward we could adjust it in various ways. It would give us flexibility without disrupting economic activity the way even Theresa May's deal would sort of disrupt economic economic activity. And now, 2 years into those negotiations, it looks like for a group of leavers, nothing but the hardest and harshest form of Brexit will somehow satisfy the mandate of the referendum. I think it's a mistake, partly because many different people voted for Brexit for different reasons and had very different ideas about what it meant. And also because the margin was, 50 to 48. There is part of the country that didn't want to leave to begin with, and we can't just sort of discard or ignore that part of the country. I think the danger we are seeing there is one of the sort of crude majoritarianism that somehow has captivated the minds of even many of my conservative friends have sort of fallen for this idea that there is such a thing as will of the people, and people have spoken, and that's the end of story. And I think I find it mind-boggling to be honest. So that's my 2 cents on Brexit. We can talk about the votes. I don't think she'll get the deal through today. The DUP, the unionists, said they wouldn't vote for it. Now the sort of European Research Group, the sort of hardcore Eurosceptics, they are willing to vote for it, but it's a small group relative to what she needs. And so I don't know, maybe we'll have to wait for April 11th and there'll be a decision made at the last moment. But I think the further the clock runs, the higher the risk of them just dropping out by accident.
Thank you, Dalibor. I thought myself that this idea that 52-48 vote is a triumph for democracy is bizarre. Clearly, it shows that there is a very strong division in the country. It may be a new political division, maybe new political cleavage is emerging. It may be the city versus the country. The oldest political division in history. Clearly, it's a deeply divided situation. And on the other hand, we would not accept changes of constitutional magnitude voted by a simple majority in any assembly. Parliamentary assembly would need a supermajority to change the constitution. This is clearly a change of constitutional magnitude. So, in a way, that was kind of disturbing. Before opening the floor to question, I just wanted to ask you if you think there is any hint we may get out of the bizarre beauty context of the other day, because I thought there was really an exotic way of voting option, just to end up saying, nobody likes any option enough to seriously vote for it.
So there was the vote on Wednesday, the indicative vote after the parliament took over control of the process, in which various options were sort of voted on and all rejected. So they didn't vote on no deal. They voted on that earlier and rejected that too. I was somehow surprised that the EEA option got so few votes. But I mean, the reality is that these members of parliament, they're not really voting their true preferences at this stage. It's sort of strategic. I don't know what sort of games is each of them playing, but I think you have to just confront them with the option of just leaving with no deal tomorrow, and maybe then just sort of reveal their preferences, and there will have to be a majority for something. Otherwise, it will be sort of no deal by default. But I want to, if I may, just react to what you said earlier about whether this is a moment that can sort of change dramatically both political parties in the UK. So our friend Steve Davis at the Institute of Economic Affairs has been making this, it's not necessarily apocalyptic, he's been making this prediction for a long time, which is that every generation or every 30 years, there's a major political realignment in politics, where the sort of coalitions of voters that have been behind political parties get sort of regrouped as different issues become salient. For a long time, these divisions in British and US and most Western European politics were running along the lines of big versus small government and social conservatism versus sort of social liberalism on issues like gay marriage and abortion rights, etc., etc. And so his argument is that now there's a new cleavage that has come into the forefront, just to do with economic openness, or not just economic, broader openness versus closedness of societies, sort of cosmopolitanism versus parochialism. And that's going to be one of the defining dividing lines in politics. And when you look at both the Tory party and Labour, they are divided on this. You have Eurosceptic, Labour MPs, including the leader. I mean, the sort of story to be told there is that Jeremy Corbyn, although the party formally endorsed Remain, never really campaigned for Remain. And it's a wonderful story years ago already in Politico about how he almost actively sabotaged the Remain campaign throughout it, because he, I think, is still stuck in his sort of 1970s mindset, which is that the EU is a sort of neoliberal plot that prevents the realization of sort of full-fledged socialist ideas that he promotes. And the Tory party obviously is divided as well, and so we've seen these moves. The independent group has been formed. So far it's small, but I mean there are seats that they could get easily 30-something seats if there were a general election. I'm not sure they have 30 candidates, but I think it might be a beginning of a process that will change the two parties in a sort of durable, more fundamental way. I mean, some people disagree. I have been having these conversations with AEI. Some people say, well, Brexit will just happen, and then it will be done. There will be nothing to talk about, and people will just go back to their old divisions. But when you think about it, Brexit will, even under the best scenario, it will take years. So even Theresa May's deal is approved, it's just a withdrawal agreement. And we have to talk about the future relationship, the future trade agreement between the EU and the UK, and so that will take years to negotiate, and people will have different opinions on what should be in it, and how much market access we should sort of have in exchange for control over our own laws. So I just don't see this problem going away anytime soon, and I think you have different sort of variations on it in the United States right now. It's not about Brexit, but the sort of same broad themes are in the forefront, and I mean in most continental European countries as well.
Well, the UK has this sensitive, big advantage, which is the electoral system.
Yeah.
So you may have two parties splitting or changing, but basically at the end of one or two election rounds, you will end up with two other parties.
But it will take, I think, a few sort of cycles to sort itself out.
And I think that hasn't worked recently. The two-party system, an electoral system that favours two parties, that's true what you say, but it hasn't worked in the last 10 years. We've had 2010 election, which led to a coalition, and the last election, but they don't have a majority. So it's something that certainly worked in the past, but it will continue to work in the future, and I'm not so sure.
Well, I think it will anyway tend to, select parties in this way. Of course, I mean, it depends how, we don't know really how they're going to be splitting, if any. And if centrist or pro-European people in one party and the other will agree upon somehow coalescing thing or not. My point of skepticism towards the thesis of Steve and yours too is that, yes, from time to time, the English political system reshuffled. It was basically, the 1850s, and then the last time was 1922. And in 1922, it basically came out with a very clear-cut idea of Stanley Baldwin, not the greatest British Prime Minister by any means, but a very good political strategist. And he thought we're going to be having a two-party system. It's going to be us versus the Labour. I don't think there is anybody now who has a clear-cut vision of how the system is going to be reshuffled. And when it comes to openness and closeness, I think it's a very interesting idea, but the key point when it comes to elections is that is this an issue people are going to be voting for? I mean, is this going to be the crucial point of somebody's political identity? Clearly, political identities are milkshakes.
Well, I would argue that it is becoming one. I mean, people feel very strongly about immigration, and there is no way to sort of get that away from the political conversation. And arguably, people these days feel more strongly about immigration than they feel about marginal tax rates or size of government, and so that might leave many classical liberals in a very uncomfortable position where you sort of either give up on some parts of your agenda, or you potentially may want to join forces with the anti-immigration forces. It's going to be tricky, but I don't think it's a uniquely British problem, and it's one that was probably in the making for quite some time, and that not many people saw coming.
Is it true that President Trump is anxiously waiting for the exit of Britain from the European Union in order to give a preferential trade agreement to UK?
So that's what the administration says. But look, like getting a free trade agreement negotiated in a way that meaningfully liberalizes things is not like a one-day affair. It takes years, and getting rid of tariffs is easy, but then having a trade agreement between the UK and the US where you would deal with questions of food safety and chlorinated chicken, these things already were tried under the auspices of TTIP and were hugely controversial in Europe, including in the UK. The sort of idea that if we had adopted TTIP, parts of the NHS would be subject to competition by US companies that could participate in procurement contracts. That's going to be controversial in the UK again, and I think there is a sense among sort of the centre left, at least, that Trump is not really sort of doing this as a selfless act, but would expect the UK to make all the concessions and US not to make any, which, I mean, given the sort of relative bargaining power, is a likely outcome. Trump, moreover, in his sort of more general attitude towards Europe, I think is sort of spoon-fed the sort of first variety of sort of anti-EU propaganda that comes from outlets like Breitbart and so forth. So he has a very distorted idea. Apparently he gets along with Jean-Claude Juncker, whom he likes, and
There's only one too, so.
But if that's a sort of basis for a sort of functioning transatlantic alliance, I don't know. I mean, there is a lot of many people in the financial industry, for example, that I've spoken with are concerned about the possibility of Trump slapping tariffs in May on national security grounds on car imports from the EU. I think it's around 20 or 25%, and that could have a major economic impact here. And the EU would probably retaliate, and it would sort of bring us to a world that's not exactly economically open. And I think that should also give our British friends pause, because the environment in which they were sort of deciding to live in 2016 was slightly different than the one we are living in today. And so, global Britain taking advantage of everything the world has to offer, that's one story. It's a different one from one in which the world might be getting increasingly more protectionist, where you have the sort of trading blocks and trade war with China, and if there's something going on across the Atlantic, it might not leave the UK in the sort of most enviable position.